Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I stood at the edge of the water, my bare feet sinking into the warm sand, while the cool waves lightly touched my toes. Summer was offering me its last warm evenings, and I was trying to capture a bit of freedom amid corporate concerns. The beach party organized by our marketing department was supposed to be a sort of break, but honestly, I wasn't too eager to participate. These events used to seem exciting to me, a chance to relax, dance under the moon, have a bit of wine, and forget about everyday worries. But in recent years, these evenings with colleagues had turned into a hollow formality. Ethan was working late again. Our conversations now mostly revolved around mundane details: what to buy, who to pick up, how best to plan the weekend. It was as if we had become neighbors living under the same roof. Something tightened in my chest when I caught myself realizing that I no longer felt the passion for him that I did in the early years of our marriage. I stepped away from the waves and headed toward the drinks table, trying not to think about how predictable my life had become. And then I heard a familiar yet new voice. "Lauren, right? We haven't met yet. I'm Derek," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. Derek was the new employee in our department. Tall, with thick chestnut hair, and a light smile that immediately caught my attention. I tried to remain composed, but I couldn't help noticing that unexpected feeling, almost magnetic attraction. We started talking about work, about projects, about colleagues, but the conversation somehow naturally flowed into more personal topics. It turns out you know a lot about literature," I remarked, surprised by his knowledge of classic literature. "I've always been fascinated by literature, especially the romance of the early 20th century," he replied. "And you, Lauren, do you read? What does literature mean to you?" His questions took me by surprise. None of my colleagues ever inquired about such things, and even Ethan rarely talked about anything like that. But Derek? His gaze was full of interest, and more importantly, respect. He listened to me as if my words mattered, and with each of his questions, I felt something inside me come alive. For me, books have always been a way to escape reality, I admitted, suddenly opening up to him more than I had to anyone in years. It's an opportunity to live another life, to experience different emotions. He nodded, and I saw understanding in his eyes. We sat on the sand and talked, as the sun gradually dipped below the horizon, and the sky grew darker. I realized that I hadn't felt so alive and engaged in a conversation in a long time. He was so confident, so easy to talk to. Derek spoke about everything with a strange but captivating honesty. "You know," he said as we discussed another book, "I often think that life is a series of random encounters. People come and go, but sometimes one encounter can change everything." His words made me think. I couldn't tell if he was joking or serious, but something in his tone, in his gaze, made me feel as if this was a challenge, something more than just a friendly conversation. As we talked, I didn't notice how the night had fully settled over the beach. The light of the lanterns illuminated the sand. The music played softer, but I no longer heard it. All I felt was his gaze, his closeness. And though my mind urged me to keep my distance, my heart whispered otherwise. This was not just a meeting, it was something unexpected, unknown, and I suddenly realized that I wanted to learn more about it. I never thought I would be so eager for lunch breaks. Now every lunch break felt like a little adventure, an opportunity to run into Derek again. By chance, but maybe not entirely so. These encounters in the elevator, in the office corridors, on the terrace, they happened as if by themselves, without prior arrangement, yet always seemed too perfectly timed to be mere coincidence. "Lauren, hey!" I heard the familiar voice behind me as I approached the cafe, hidden in the shadow of a tall building. This place had long become my favorite little hideaway, where I could enjoy a cup of coffee and briefly escape the routine. Derek stood at the entrance, slightly leaning forward, as if he had been waiting for me on purpose. I smiled and tried to maintain a casual composure, though something inside me leaped with joy. Hi, Derek, I replied. You decided to take a break too? Of course, he smiled, as if we had prearranged to meet here. Maybe you'd like to join me? I promise I won't take up too much of your time. I nodded and sat down at his table, feeling both excited and a little guilty, not towards anyone in particular, but towards myself. We ordered coffee and light snacks, and then, once again, we delved into a conversation just as we had on the beach. Our talks always started with something mundane, but somehow they always drifted into deeper waters. You love art, right? He asked unexpectedly when I was telling him about a new marketing campaign we were working on. Why haven't you tried something related to it? I paused. No one had ever asked me such questions, not even Ethan. He knew I was passionate about painting, but he never wondered why I chose marketing over art. Life doesn't always allow you to follow your dreams, I replied, trying not to reveal my slight embarrassment. I chose stability. Maybe it wasn't the right decision. Derek nodded, and there was a warm concern in his eyes, as if he understood my hidden regrets. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt something between us become even more tangible. That attraction, which had been barely noticeable on the beach, had now turned into something almost physical. In the following days, our encounters became more frequent. At first, they were random crossings in the office, but then I noticed that he increasingly appeared in the same places as I did: the elevator, lunch breaks, the cafe. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time, as if both of us were searching for an excuse to stay alone together for just a few more minutes. Lauren, he said one day, when we ran into each other again at the cafe, I have a suggestion. We could have dinner together and discuss the new project. I know a great place nearby. I hesitated. Something inside told me that this wasn't just a dinner, but Derek's voice, his light smile, and that sparkle in his eyes, which I had come to recognize so well, convinced me. All right, I answered, trying to sound casual. It wouldn't hurt, right? We agreed to meet in the evening at the small restaurant he had mentioned. I knew that having dinner with a colleague wasn't anything unusual, but the sense of secret anticipation wouldn't leave me. I spent the whole day thinking about our conversation, about his gaze, about how he made me feel. In my head, I tried to convince myself that it was just a business meeting, that I wasn't crossing any lines. But my heart already started beating faster as soon as I pictured myself sitting next to him at a table, in candlelight, in a secluded setting. As I left the office, my steps were decisive, but something inside me fluttered. It was hard to tell if it was excitement or something more. One thing I knew: dinner with Derek promised to be interesting, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. The rooftop restaurant turned out to be even more impressive than I could have imagined. From the very first steps, I felt my breath catch at the sight of the night city stretching out below. The lights of the cars, the endless rows of glowing windows, and the majestic buildings. All of this created an amazing feeling that we had found ourselves in another world, where time seemed to have stopped. Derek chose a table next to the large panoramic windows. The soft light of the candles on the table reflected in the glass, adding even more romance to the place. I looked around, trying to stay calm, but something was churning inside me, a mixture of anticipation, excitement, and slight fear. Beautiful place, isn't it? Derek asked, smiling at me. Yes, incredible, I replied, not knowing how else to express my impressions. We placed our order, and the conversation, which started with discussing a work project, quickly shifted to more personal topics. Derek talked about his travels, about how he once ended up in a small village in southern France and fell in love with the simple life of the locals. I listened to him as if enchanted and caught myself thinking that I couldn't take my eyes off his face. He was so lively, so real, that next to this bright person, I began to feel colorless. And what about you, Lauren? He asked, interrupting my thoughts. What do you dream about? I paused for a moment. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't asked myself that in so long that I had almost forgotten what it meant to dream. But now, in this moment, under his intense gaze, I suddenly felt my own desires awaken. "I don't know," I replied quietly. "I think I've forgotten what it means to dream." Derek didn't look away. His face grew serious. "Sometimes we just need a reminder," he said. "From time to time, life gives us a chance to remember what truly matters to us." His words seemed to pierce me. I felt my heart start to beat faster, and to hide my embarrassment, I decided to take a sip of wine. The drink was rich and tart, leaving a warm aftertaste. I felt a pleasant relaxation spread through my body. We continued our conversation, now discussing our childhood dreams, things that once seemed important, but were forgotten under the weight of adult responsibilities. I felt something invisible but palpable growing between us, like a thin thread binding us closer together. As dinner drew to a close, I realized that I needed some fresh air. The atmosphere of the restaurant, its coziness, and Derek's proximity were beginning to have a hypnotic effect on me. "I'll step outside for a minute," I said, getting up from the table. Derek nodded, and I headed towards the wooden terrace on the other side of the roof. The night air was cool and fresh, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm my thoughts. The city lights twinkled around, creating the illusion of a starry sky beneath my feet. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to just be for a moment. "Decided to run away from me?" I heard Derek's soft voice behind me. I turned and met his gaze. He stood so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. My heart skipped a beat, and I didn't know how to react to his presence so close. "No," I replied, unable to tear my eyes away from his. "I just wanted to get some fresh air." He smiled, and in his eyes, I saw that same spark that made me feel alive. "Sometimes you really do need fresh air to think about what's important," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I took a step back to maintain some distance, but he gently pulled me closer by the hand. My thoughts were in disarray. I knew I should stop, but something deep inside, something inexplicable, was drawing me to him. At that moment, I felt his touch on my cheek, tender yet decisive. His fingers were warm, and my skin ignited under his touch. I didn't have time to process what was happening, but suddenly his lips were on mine. It was soft, almost tentative, but at the same time filled with such passionate desire that I couldn't resist. The city lights flickered around us, and in that moment, it felt as if the entire world had disappeared, leaving only the two of us. The workdays returned with all their monotony and predictability. The office, paperwork, phone calls, meetings, it all blended into a single gray stream, and I tried to find some meaning in it. But in every action, in every moment, there was now a shadow of that evening on the terrace, when the world suddenly changed. I tried to keep myself together. Every time I saw Ethan, a wave of guilt rose within me. He was the same as always, caring, attentive, perhaps a little tired. I understood that he suspected nothing. But every time I tried to push thoughts of Derek away, I felt something inside resist, as if it had become a part of me that I couldn't get rid of. And then, at the very first meeting dedicated to the new project, I saw him again. Derek entered the conference room with his usual ease. His smile was calm, but his gaze, which lingered on me, spoke more than words. I felt my heart start to pound, and I quickly lowered my eyes to the documents in front of me, trying to maintain composure. "We have a few ideas," he began, addressing the team, "but maybe it's worth discussing them in a more private setting." I felt his eyes briefly linger on me again. The room was silent. Colleagues nodded in agreement, and before I could say anything, Derek suggested using the small meeting room located at the far end of the office. "Lauren, will you join me?" His voice was calm, but there was a barely noticeable hint of challenge in it. I nodded, feeling tension envelop me. We walked down the hallway, leaving the others behind. The small meeting room was a secluded place, rarely visited by anyone. The door closed behind us, and I suddenly realized that we were alone. Derek immediately moved closer, reducing the distance between us to a minimum. His gaze was focused, almost demanding. "Lauren, do you feel it as much as I do?" he whispered, and I detected a strange combination of confidence and vulnerability in his voice. I remained silent, not knowing what to say. It was too much. Everything, every word he said, every gesture filled me with both fear and exhilaration. I understood that I was standing on the edge, on the thin line between what was right and what I wanted. "Derek," I said quietly, trying to pull myself together. "We can't. It's wrong." He took a step forward, and I felt his hand slide along my shoulder. His touch was light, almost weightless, but I felt goosebumps spread across my skin. "Wrong?" His voice was a whisper, like a secret. "Or just scary?" His words pierced me. I felt everything inside boiling with contradictions. I knew I should stop, that this moment was the last chance to step back. But something deep inside told me that I had already crossed that line. Derek slowly leaned in, and I felt his breath on my neck. His hands now slid down my back, and I realized that I could no longer resist. In his embrace, there was warmth and confidence that I so desperately lacked. "Lauren," he whispered again, bringing his face closer to mine. "You can deceive everyone, but not yourself." I felt his lips barely touch mine, and the world around us disappeared. Our touches became more daring. His hands roamed my body, and I couldn't stop myself. All my logic, all reason vanished under the flood of emotions and desire. We only stopped when we heard footsteps in the hallway outside the door. I quickly pulled away, my heart racing, and I tried to hide my embarrassment. "We need to go back," I said quietly, trying not to meet his gaze. Derek nodded, but I saw the same fire in his eyes that was burning inside me. We left the room, trying to stay as far from each other as possible, so no one would suspect anything. But I already knew that this was just the beginning of something I couldn't control. Once, Derek and I decided to leave the city under the pretext of working on a project, but we both knew the truth was far more complicated. Our glances, words, touches, all pointed to the fact that this wasn't just a business trip. Derek drove confidently, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. We were silent, but the tension between us hung in the air, almost palpable. I tried not to think about what we were doing. I knew it was wrong, that we were playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Every time our eyes met in the rearview mirror, I felt my heart skip a beat. "Are you sure you want this?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know," I admitted, staring straight ahead, "but I can't resist anymore." He smiled, and in his eyes, I saw that same spark that had captivated me from the very beginning. The road led us to a narrow turn, and soon we stopped in front of a small country house. It was surrounded by trees, creating a sense of seclusion, as if we had ended up far from the rest of the world. We got out of the car, and Derek took my hand, leading me to the front door. His touch was decisive and confident, and I felt a flutter inside. The house was simple but cozy, with wooden walls and large windows through which soft daylight streamed. "No one will see us here," he said, closing the door behind us. I took a few steps inside, feeling the air grow thicker. It was so quiet inside that I could hear nothing but my breathing and the beating of my heart. We stood silently, gazing at each other as the tension between us grew. Derek stepped closer, his gaze intense, his breathing heavy. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. My eyes followed his movement, and I felt my body begin to react to his closeness. "Lauren," he said softly, almost in a whisper, "you can stop now. But if not—" "I don't want to stop," I whispered. In this secluded house, where no one could see or judge us, we gave in to the passion that had been building between us since that first glance on the beach. For the first time in a long while, I felt alive, free from all constraints and conventions. We moved around the room, our bodies seemingly entwined together in this silent dance. We didn't speak, because words were unnecessary. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken through our touches, our kisses. I didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how this would change my life. But at that moment, it didn't matter to me. I was here now, with Derek, and that was all that mattered. When it was all over, we lay on the floor, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. I turned to him and saw that he was looking at me with the same sincerity he had shown all along. His fingers gently slid through my hair, and I felt warmth spread through me once again. "Lauren," he whispered, "I don't know where this will lead, but I'm glad we're here." I smiled and replied quietly, "So am I." When we had already returned home and arranged to meet again, I stood at the edge of the alley, nervously glancing around, waiting for him. My heart was beating faster than usual, and thoughts of how far I had gone kept playing over and over in my mind. Derek appeared out of the shadows as quietly as a ghost. His figure was barely visible in the twilight, but I immediately recognized his walk, his silhouette. As he got closer, his eyes gleamed, and I felt a warm wave rush through my body. "Lauren," he said with a soft smile as he approached. "Sorry to keep you waiting." "It's okay," I replied, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. "I came a little early myself." We couldn't help but step toward each other, our hands meeting, and I felt his firm handshake as if he was trying to transfer his confidence to me. The silence in the air was only broken by the occasional sounds of night birds. We both knew that these meetings were becoming more dangerous by the day, but we couldn't stop. "Does Ethan suspect anything?" Derek asked quietly, studying my face. I looked away, feeling my cheeks flush. Yes, Ethan was starting to suspect something. Lately, he'd been asking more and more questions. "Where were you? Why did you come back so late? You've seemed so distant lately." I tried to come up with excuses, saying that I had a lot of work, that I was tired, but I could feel his suspicions growing. "He's starting to ask questions," I finally admitted. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Derek nodded, his face remaining calm, but I could see a shadow of concern in his eyes. "You know you can stop at any time," he said quietly, but there was a note in his voice that said, "I don't want you to stop." I felt a tightening inside. I knew I was risking everything, my marriage, my reputation, my future. But every time I saw Derek when we were together, everything else faded away. Everything seemed so insignificant, so small compared to this feeling of freedom and passion. "I don't want to stop," I whispered, realizing that this admission held the entire truth of what I felt. Derek smiled and pulled me closer, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. We walked through the empty alleys of the park, holding hands like teenagers hiding from the world. Every step, every glance, every accidental touch brought me joy, but also fear. We found a bench in a secluded corner of the park, hidden from prying eyes by bushes. Derek sat down first, pulling me toward him, and I sank down beside him, feeling his arm drape over my shoulders. The night air was cool, but his warmth kept me cozy. "I know this is dangerous," he said, as if reading my thoughts, "but I've never felt so alive as I do with you." I turned my head and met his gaze. In that moment, I knew he was telling the truth. I had never felt so alive, so free either. But I also knew that this freedom could lead to disaster. We stayed in the park until late at night, talking, laughing, immersing ourselves in a world that belonged only to us. But I understood that this world was an illusion, that reality would catch up with us sooner or later. When we finally decided to leave, Derek leaned in and whispered softly to me, "Lauren, whatever happens, remember that I'm here for you." I nodded, but deep down, I felt like I was beginning to lose control. Ethan suspected that something was wrong. I noticed how his gaze grew more watchful, how he tried to find out where I was going and who I was meeting. He didn't know the truth, but I knew that his patience wouldn't last forever. As I returned home that night, I felt like I was walking on the edge of a cliff. I knew I needed to stop, that one day everything could spiral out of control. But how do you stop when your heart demands one thing and your mind another? The office was filled with the usual noise: phone calls, the clattering of keyboards, muted conversations. I tried to focus on my computer, but my thoughts were restlessly wandering. The past few weeks had been like a whirlwind, sweeping me off my feet. I felt like I was on the edge. With each passing day, it became harder to hide our relationship with Derek. Susan, my colleague, suddenly appeared in the hallway just as I, a bit hastily, was leaving the office with Derek. She paused for a moment, clearly noticing how our hands accidentally touched, and then continued on her way, but her gaze remained etched in my memory. Susan was known for her curiosity and her ability to notice details that others might overlook. I tried not to make much of it, but something inside me twinged. The next day, she started appearing in places where no one usually saw Derek and me. In the cafeteria, by the window on the stair landing, she seemed to be watching us, and every time our eyes met, I felt that she suspected something. I tried to ignore her presence, staying calm and focused on work. But within a few days, rumors began to spread through the office like wildfire. At first, it was just whispers behind my back, passing glances, then stifled giggles in the corridors. I didn't immediately realize what was happening until one of my colleagues, Lisa, approached me with a hint in her voice. "Lauren," she said, trying to appear innocent, "do you happen to know why everyone suddenly started talking about you and Derek?" My heart skipped a beat. I felt the heat rush to my cheeks, but I tried to mask my emotions with a forced smile. "No, Lisa, I don't. What are they saying?" "Well, they're saying there's something going on between you two," she replied, almost offhandedly. "Though everyone knows you're married to Ethan." I tried to stay calm, but inside, everything was boiling. Susan. It had to be her. She somehow figured it out and decided to use this knowledge. Soon, I started noticing that Susan was appearing more frequently around me, catching my gaze, eavesdropping on conversations. I tried to keep my distance, but I felt she was becoming increasingly persistent. One day, during the lunch break, I overheard Susan talking to someone from the department in the hallway. "Yes, I definitely saw them leaving together," she said in a loud whisper, clearly intending for me to hear. "And besides, she's married, but acts like she's single. I wonder what her husband thinks about all this." I felt a tight knot form inside. Susan's words were like sharp needles piercing my heart. I knew she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. Now every step in the office felt like it was under a microscope, every movement of mine discussed and judged. When I met Derek in the conference room for the next meeting, he immediately noticed my state. "Did something happen?" he asked, squinting. "Susan," I began, taking a deep breath. "She's starting to suspect us. And now the whole office is talking about it." He frowned, and a shadow of concern flickered in his eyes. "We need to be more careful," he said quietly, "but don't let her destroy what we have." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the anxiety. I understood that I was risking everything, and now that risk had become tangible, palpable. I knew Susan wouldn't stop, and I'd have to find a way to deal with it before everything spiraled out of control. But as I stood there in the conference room, watching my colleagues steal glances at me, I realized that my situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Ethan had started asking questions, and now the entire office was abuzz with rumors. I found myself at the center of a whirlwind with no easy way out. The house was dark, with only a dim light from the hallway illuminating a small part of the living room. I stood by the window, unsure how long I could endure this tense silence that had recently become a part of my life. Inside, everything was tightening with the premonition that something inevitable was about to happen. Ethan came home from work later than usual. I heard his footsteps approaching the front door, the sound of the key turning in the lock. Something inside me snapped. I could feel his presence even before he entered the room. He was focused, his face strangely calm, but I noticed anxiety and suspicion in his eyes. "Lauren, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him and taking off his coat. His voice sounded unusually serious. I took a step back, feeling a chill run down my spine. I knew this moment was inevitable, that there was no running from it, but I still hoped that I could somehow explain, find the words that would smooth out the sharpness of what was about to happen. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, trying to appear calm. He stepped closer, and I felt his eyes piercing me, as if trying to read my thoughts. "I've heard from your colleagues," he began slowly, "that you've been spending a lot of time with some man. Derek, right?" I felt my heart skip a beat. Everything clicked into place. Susan. Of course it was her. Now it all made sense. "Ethan, it's not what you think," I started, trying to find the right words, but he interrupted me. "Not what I think?" His voice rose, a sharpness in it. "Are you trying to tell me there's nothing between you two? That all these rumors are just made up?" I knew there was no point in lying. Words would only make the situation worse. He had already heard enough to understand the truth, and I also knew that I couldn't hide what had happened any longer. "No, Ethan," I finally said, feeling everything tighten inside me. "It's true. I have feelings for someone else." His eyes widened in surprise, then anger. He stood there, as if struck, not knowing what to say or do. "How could you?" he said, his voice sounding hollow, as if from afar. "How could you do this to me, to us? After everything we've been through together?" I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I tried not to cry. Inside, emotions were boiling, guilt, pain, and despair. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. "I didn't plan for this. I didn't want it to happen." "Didn't want it?" His voice grew louder, almost shouting. "But you let it happen, Lauren. You destroyed everything we had." He took a step forward, his face illuminated by the light from the hallway. I could see the red patches of anger on his cheeks. I knew I couldn't justify myself, that he was right, and all I could do was stand there and take his words. "Leave," he suddenly said sharply, and I flinched at his tone. "What?" I couldn't believe my ears. "I said leave," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. "I don't want to see you here anymore. Pack your things and get out of my house." I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. His words hit me like a whip. I realized he was serious, that there was no turning back. I felt the tears finally rolling down my cheeks, and I tried to hold back, but I couldn't. "Please, Ethan, let's talk." I tried again, but he cut me off harshly. "No, Lauren, there's nothing more to talk about." His voice was trembling with rage. "Leave, before I lose the last shred of patience." I understood he wasn't joking, that he really wanted me to leave. In a daze, I headed to the bedroom to pack my things. I felt like my legs could barely hold me, like everything around me was blurred and unclear. I packed a few things into a bag, feeling the tears clouding my vision. I knew this was the end of my marriage, the end of the life I had known. When I returned to the living room, Ethan was standing by the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. I stopped in the doorway, holding the bag in my hand, and looked at him one last time. I wanted to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. He didn't turn around, and I realized he didn't want to see me anymore. I turned and walked out the door, feeling the cold night air hit my face. The door closed behind me, and I realized that now I would have to start all over again. But at that moment, standing on the threshold of a house that was no longer mine, I didn't know where to begin. The night was cold and windy, and I wandered through the empty streets, not knowing where I was going. The city around me, which had always been home, now seemed foreign and hostile. I didn't know what to do next. My steps were automatic, as if my body knew where to go, while my mind had refused to participate in the process. Ethan, his angry face, his last words, these now echoed in my head. I realized that I had lost him forever, that the way back was closed, and I would have to come to terms with it. But how? How do you come to terms with your life being shattered into pieces? How do you move on knowing that you destroyed everything you had? I walked, thinking about who might understand me, who could offer support. The only name that came to mind was Derek. He was the one I could be honest with, the one I could trust. Despite everything that had happened, he remained the only person with whom I could start over. I dialed his number without thinking, without planning. My heart pounded in my chest as the ringing stretched into the silence. Finally, his voice came through on the other end. Lauren! He sounded surprised but not angry. What's happened? Derek! I felt my voice tremble. I need to talk to you. I can't stay here anymore. He was silent for a moment, then said firmly, Where are you? I'll come get you. I gave him the address, and he arrived quickly. His car pulled up to the curb, and he opened the passenger door, inviting me in with a gesture. I got inside, and he immediately sensed something was wrong. What happened? He asked, looking at me with concern. Ethan! I could barely say his name. He found out. It's over. He kicked me out. Derek nodded, his face tense, but I saw sympathy in his eyes. He reached out and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. I'm sorry, Lauren. I knew this could happen, but I didn't want to believe it. What do you want to do next? I didn't know how to answer. Everything seemed so unclear, so tangled. I don't know, I whispered. I just can't stay here. I need to leave. Derek looked at me seriously. Then let's go, he suggested. Let's start over somewhere else, in a different city where no one knows us, where we can build our lives from scratch. His words seemed so simple, yet so frightening at the same time. I looked at him and thought this might be a chance to escape everything I had destroyed, from all the consequences of my mistakes, but I wasn't sure if it would help. Do you really think it's possible? I asked quietly. I know it's not easy, he replied, but I'm willing to try if you are. We both made mistakes, Lauren, but maybe this is our chance to fix them. I sighed and nodded. Deep down, I understood there were no other options. I couldn't stay in this city, among these streets that reminded me of every mistake, every missed opportunity. Okay, I finally said. Let's try. Derek smiled, his eyes lighting up with hope. He started the car, and we drove away from this place, away from everything that was familiar and routine. Past the buildings where I had once lived, past the parks where Ethan and I had walked. Now, all that was behind us. We drove for a long time, and I stared out the window, watching as the darkness swallowed the city. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this step would mark the beginning of a new chapter. But what kind? I couldn't predict. All I had now was uncertainty, and the person sitting beside me, ready to try starting over. Eventually, we stopped at a small hotel on the outskirts of town. Derek checked us in, and we went inside, tired and empty. He embraced me, and I felt his warmth gradually dispelling the cold and fear. We'll make it, he whispered, and I nodded, trying to believe his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was indeed our chance for a fresh start.